I decided to work this up for Juneteenth. It's been a long time coming. I've promised the conclusion of my New Orleans trilogy. New Orleans, as anybody who's been there or done any research on it, it's a very complicated place with a very complex history. But there's a lot going on there under the surface that if you just go there as a casual tourist, you're not going to pick up on. So New Orleans, rightly, wound up probably being the centerpiece of the effort to remove Confederate monuments. You're talking about a city that I've seen different numbers, but best information I have is 68% black, that until 2017 had arguably the most prominent collection of Confederate monuments and street names of any American city. You had Lee Circle, you had Jefferson, Davis, Parkway, I think it was. So this was a report done at the time that they started to remove these monuments. And I just want to mention the very first one they did, that's what this is. This was a monument that memorialized the Crescent City White League, that during Reconstruction, because there had been a contested election, I think in 1866 or 67, there had been a contested election where they mounted an insurrection against the integrated police force and National Guard and killed 35 people. This monument, they took this plaque off later on, but the original plaque memorialized the triumph of white supremacy in the South. It literally said that on this monument. They had to remove it in the middle of the night for fear of violence and rioting. They wore bulletproof vests, and the construction workers wore masks so that they could not be recognized. They covered up their company logos so there would be no retaliation. So understand, to 2017, there was a monument in a predominantly black city to the Crescent City White League that mounted a violent insurrection against Reconstruction, killing 35 people. This was memorializing that battle, as it was called. All right, so I have a video of a local news report from the time.
152 years and 1 month after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant, a statue of Lee is falling in New Orleans tonight. Omar Villafranca is there.
After 133 years of standing over New Orleans, a statue dedicated to Confederate General Robert E. Lee is the final statue
2017.
to come down. New Orleans Mayor Mitch
They
Landry.
should have just left it like that with a noose around his neck, not taking it down. Just kept it there. Just leave the crane there with the blue rope around his neck. That's the new statue. That's the new monument.
Confederate General Robert E. Lee is the final statue to come down. New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landry.
These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement.
The statue of Lee is the first one to come down in broad daylight. Under the cover of darkness, workers removed the statues for Confederate President Jefferson Davis, General P.G.T. Beauregard, and the Liberty Monument because...
All right, so just to let you know, P.G.T. Beauregard was a Louisiana general who was a prominent general in the Civil War, and actually the commanding general in the opening round of the Civil War. It was his troops that fired on Antietam to really start armed hostilities. They are still very proud of him down there. He is mentioned in quite a few historical plaques and not in an unkind way.
Police say there were threats made against the crews.
If we take down these statutes and don't change to become a more open and inclusive society, then all of this would have been in vain.
Protests erupted in New Orleans when the city decided to remove the monuments. Both sides argued over whether these monuments celebrated racism or Southern heritage. Dr. Maria Ortiz with the Southern Christian Leadership Council worked for 44 years to bring the monuments down.
I would point up there and I would say, you devil, you coming down one day. I thought of the oppression and what my grandmother and they sweat and blood down in this soil.
Businessman Frank Stewart thinks the statues should remain.
I really don't think that anybody should have the privilege of changing history, because history is truth.
I mean, you can't always judge a book by its cover, but sometimes you can. I would have guessed that guy would be against removing the statues. Yes.
I really don't think that anybody should have the privilege of changing history, because history is truth.
No word on where the statues will end up, but Anthony, the mayor, says they cannot be displayed outdoors on public property.
Omar Villafranca. Thank you, Omar.
All right. So problem solved, right? Problem solved. Now, really, the reason I wanted to do this today is you have a lot of people who, partly because, and this is why I speak out so much against the people who grift off of claims of white supremacy and structural racism. The reason I get so angry about people like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo is because they discredit a legitimate argument with their advocacy of it, because it's so clear that they are just grifters making money off racial division. But I challenge you by the end of this to say, oh, no, we don't have these problems anymore in America. And this is a really good example, because the impression you would get is, oh, well, they took down the monuments. Happy ending, right? So I can now from here, these are my own photos. All right, so that's Lee Circle now. The statue of Lee, you can see, is gone. But just one block away from Lee Circle is the Memorial Hall Civil War Museum. Now, they have changed the name several times, but what it really is a memorial to the Confederate cause. That is what it is. And I didn't realize that when I went. I didn't go there to see, oh my God, this white supremacist museum. I took it at its word. I thought it was a fucking Civil War museum. No. Okay, so
formerly the Yankee Tomfoolery Museum. Now,
formerly the War of Northern Aggression Museum. So, all right. So you walk in. So this is what you see. All right. And understand, I'm not saying that there's no place in this world for a museum about the Confederacy. I mean, sure there is. I mean, it is a part of history. There is no place for a museum that celebrates the Confederacy, which they will deny. And I'm going to demonstrate very clearly that is a very weak argument to say that that's not what it is. Okay, so you have things in here that, sure, all right, I mean, this stuff is interesting. The firearms, the uniforms, medical kits with a history of the doctor who had it. This was like a 19th century Viewmaster. It's kind of steampunk, made out of wood, but it gave you kind of the three-dimensional view. All right. I mean, that's all interesting enough. Then you start to notice things. Okay, so this is a list of all of the reunions of Confederate soldiers. They had reunions into 1951. I guess the last of them died off after that. But these are all the locations and dates of Confederate soldier reunions. And then you see the poster advertising the Confederate reunions. Start to say, It's kind of seems like they're a little nostalgic for the good old days of the Confederate reunions, but okay.
This is the moment of the Scientology film screening when you realize the door is locked from the outside.
Creepy people in 19th century dress start to close in around you. Yeah. Well, sugar, you're a Yankee, ain't you?
Yeah.
All right.
Like, so Get Out for northern white liberals.
All right. So the will to fight. Now, this is where you really start to see the museum's agenda. Now, I am a museum freak. I'm the kind of person who will read pretty much all the placards within reason, especially in a small museum like this. So I can tell you this museum definitely had an agenda in what it included in its description of the Civil War and what it left out. And this is an excellent example. So this is about who fought on both sides. I thought I might need my glasses here. I'm gonna throw these on.
Yeah, it's pretty tiny.
All right. The average soldier was a single male native-born farmer between 18 and 39 who stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed about 140 pounds. Most soldiers averaged just 26 years of age, while the majority on both sides gave their occupation as farmer. Union troops alluded to more than 300 different careers, including accountant, surveyor, and so on. Non-farming Confederate troops listed occupations that included carpenter, all right, and so on. While the majority of the men on both sides were of the various Protestant faiths, many, especially from within Louisiana, were Roman Catholic. 7,000 men of the Jewish faith fought for the North, and 3,000 fought for the South. Large numbers of immigrants swelled the ranks of both sides, particularly in the North. Almost 1/4 of the Union soldiers were immigrants, including 200,000 Germans, 150,000 Irish, 45,000 English, 15,000 Canadians, and lesser numbers of French, Norwegians, Italians, Mexicans, and Poles. The South mustered fewer immigrants to the colors, but thousands of Irish, Germans, British, French, Canadians, Dutch, and Austrians entered the Confederate Army at different times. Keaton, it's very strange. It's very strange. It seems like they left somebody out. It seems like somebody was forgotten in this very extensive list. You're talking about Poles and Canadians and Brits and Germans and Jews. They seem to have forgotten somebody in a war over slavery, which they deny in another place. We'll get into that. They didn't mention any black people fighting on either side. They just didn't mention them. They just, poof, they just disappeared from history. So is this because there were so few? No. By the time the war ended in 1865, about 180,000 black men had served as soldiers in the U.S. Army. This was about 10% of the total Union fighting force. Most, about 90,000, were former or contraband enslaved people from the Confederate States. About half of the rest were from the loyal border states, and the rest were free black people from the North. 40,000 black soldiers died in the war, 10,000 in battle, and 30,000 from illness or infection. Okay. So let's say that this is really about what a lot of them will say that this museum is about. It's about Southern heritage. It's about the Southern heritage. It has nothing to do with racism. And so they didn't even want to talk about the North, even though they did in detail, except for this detail. But hey, there were black Confederates that they didn't mention. That's pretty weird in a Confederate museum. You don't want to mention blacks that fought alongside you. This from The Root, is not from Southern Cracker Weekly. This is from The Root. Between 3,000 and 6,000 served as Confederate soldiers. Another 100,000 or so blacks, mostly slaves, supported the Confederacy as laborers, servants, and teamsters. They built roads, batteries, and fortifications, manned munitions factories, essentially did the Confederacy's dirty work. We know that blacks made up more than half the toilers at Richmond's Tredegar Ironworks and more than 75% of the workforce at Selma, Alabama's Naval Ordnance Plant. And slaves grew the crops that fed the Confederacy. As Frederick Douglass noted, blacks were the stomach of the rebellion. Okay. All right. So let's say clearly this museum does not want to talk about slavery, all right? So let's say that's what it's about. They don't want to talk about slavery. What's particularly weird in a museum in New Orleans, in Louisiana, to not talk about this is because of its unique and unusual history of having been governed first by France and then by Spain rather than by England. Louisiana was much more likely to have Confederate blacks than anywhere else in the country because you had more free blacks of the planter class than you had anywhere else. The most prominent example of free black Confederate troops is the Louisiana Native Guards based in New Orleans. Now, remember, the main hall, which you will see, is full of the flags of all the Louisiana regiments, but not this one. Not the Louisiana Native Guards. I didn't mention that. Why not? Why not? I mean, I would think it would reinforce your argument that the war wasn't about slavery, right? I mean, it wouldn't prove it, but I mean, you could use it, but they don't. Some 1,500 men enlisted, and early in the war, they announced their determination to, quote, take arms at a moment's notice and fight shoulder to shoulder with other citizens in defense of the city. Part of the state militia, they marched in review through the streets with white soldiers, but they were never ordered into combat. And when Union forces captured New Orleans in the spring of 1862, they switched sides and declared their loyalty to the Union. General Benjamin Butler, commander of the Union forces in New Orleans, interviewed some native guards and asked them why they had served a government created to perpetuate slavery. They, quote, dared not refuse, they told Butler, according to the book General Butler in New Orleans, published in 1864 by the biographer James Parton. By serving the Confederates, they hoped to advance a little nearer to equality with whites. Many, if not most, free blacks in and around New Orleans aligned themselves with the planter class in hopes of greater rights. In this sense, the region more closely resembled the Caribbean than the Cotton South, with a comparatively large population of elite free blacks, most of them light-skinned. Some were slave owners, and among the wealthiest free blacks in the country, as the economic historian Juliet Walker has documented. Okay, so this is very focused not only on the Confederacy, but on the Louisiana experience during the Civil War. Completely erased. Does not appear, not a mention of this in the museum whatsoever. So, it's kind of like when Putin said when they wouldn't let him into NATO, well, you say it's not about us, but it seems kind of like it's about us. Well, you say it's not about excluding black people, but it kind of seems like it's about excluding black people. Even when they fought on your side. So this is why I mention I'm a museum freak and I pretty much read everything. I pretty much literally read every single one of these placards in the entire museum. Few placards that were just biographical details of a random soldier or the construction of a ship I didn't read, but anything like this that gave an overview. So I can tell you with some confidence, this plaque is literally the only place where they mention slavery in a Civil War museum. It was the only place where I saw the word slavery used. So what do they say about the causes of the Civil War? Let's see. The northern states did not favor the expansion of the institution of slavery into the western territories, now those states north of Texas and between Arkansas and California. The agricultural southern states did favor the expansion and believed that the duty of the federal government was to defend the nation, not intervene in matters they felt better left to the individual states. Well, that sounds reasonable. The drumbeat of the 1850s was augmented by a small but organized abolitionist movement that stirred northern sentiment against the South. Now note what they're implying here, right? This was just one of those things where they had a kind of, disagreement amongst themselves. And it was a small number of abolitionists, but they turned those northern Yankees against us with their propaganda. The intense political and ideological strife between North and South increased dramatically in the years before the war. The John Brown raid and the hotly contested election of 1860 only fanned the flames of coming war. In 1859, abolitionist and religious zealot named John Brown attacked and seized the United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to obtain weapons from the arsenal and free the slaves in Harper's Ferry. He was soon captured by a company of Marines under the command of Lieutenant Israel Green. The military operation to put down the raid was led by Colonel Robert E. Lee. I never knew that. Did you know that, Keaton?
No.
Brown was sentenced to death and was later hanged in Charleston, Virginia, now West Virginia. Quote, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Crazy religious fanatic and that small group of abolitionists who stirred up the North against us. So that's it. That's it. That is what they have to say about slavery in this entire museum. There is not another word about it. I feel pretty confident in saying. Now, if you have any doubt at this point in your journey through this museum of what the point of view of this museum is, right behind you, they're playing a video on a continuous loop of the glorious history of the museum and of the lost cause. Now, we can't play any of that video, but I will show you one screenshot of some text. Memorial Hall continues to stand as a monument to its founders and as a repository of cherished stories and memorabilia from the war between the states. I shit you not. The war between the states. When I was studying actually for the New Orleans tour guide exam, it was described as the war between the states, although not on the test itself, to be fair. All right, so in the main hall, this is the kind of thing you're going to see. Like I said, all the regimental flags, except the Black Regiment. Very loving portraits of wonderful people like Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, the aforementioned PGT Beauregard, local hero. And this is the view from the upper gallery, where the widow and daughter of Jefferson Davis donated over 20 trunks of his personal effects to the museum. So, it's funny. This is almost like somebody made a movie called CSA that was like an alternate history America where the South had won. That's kind of what this is, because you've unless you're into this, you've never seen these kind of like glorified portraits of Civil War battles from the South's point of view. But this was in Jefferson Davis's office, portrays Stonewall Jackson in a triumphant moment.
Well, this would just be like the inside of an IHOP if they won. Like they would all be decorated like that. It'd just be standard decor.
This would be your neighborhood Denny's.
Yeah, Denny's, America's Diner. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this was a gift. The Catholic Church being on the right side of history, like they do. This was a gift from the Pope to Jefferson Davis. While after he had even lost the war, he was in prison. The church was apparently very sympathetic to the lost cause. This is his family Bible, his personal effects, and just to show you how much they're sanctifying the Confederacy, you can see they put in stained glass windows, and this was paid for by the Daughters of the Confederacy. They actually paid for this stained glass. And to really bring the point home, the final section of the museum gets into the Reconstruction period. And the narrative, they're careful not to get too overt these days, but it very much is the narrative of an oppressed Southern people resisting any way that they can the oppressive presence of their Northern occupiers. So this, it was illegal to represent the stars and bars during Reconstruction. So this was a painter who wove the stars and bars into a seemingly innocuous floral print. And the tone of the narrative about it is very much like the point of view of a people who had been oppressed during this period and what they did to resist. Okay, so this is quite remarkable, especially when you consider that the city is 68% Black, that such a museum still stands. just this, no question, glorifying the Confederacy. And if you have any doubt, if you still say, it's just a museum. All right, so here's what you can find in the gift shop before you leave. If you just want a little portrait of Jefferson Davis hanging in your home, pick up one of those. If you want to impress your friends at aforementioned Denny's with your CSA belt buckle, you can get one of those. You can get a Stars and Bars flag. Mugs with quotes. So now anyone who says this is a history museum, well, they have museums at Auschwitz. I don't think they have any mugs with Goebbels saying people will believe any lie as long as you make it big enough. I mean, clearly you're glorifying these people when you're and look at what they're quoting from Jefferson Davis. Neither current events nor history show that the majority rule or ever did rule. Wow, that is very fucking inspirational. Jefferson Davis, who, by the way, when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, declared it the most execrable law ever passed by man and promised to kill or enslave any black soldier who got captured behind enemy lines. That's the guy who they're putting on a mug here. Little cameo magnets in case you're a cheapskate. Little Christmas ornament. Little Stars and Bars Christmas ornament for the Stormfront crowd. Stars and Bars bookmark, patches. Okay, so how does this exist? How does this exist in a majority black city? Where does the money come from? Where does the support for this come from? Well, in New Orleans, and I'm sure in a lot of other places in the South, but I'm only really familiar with this region because I've spent so much time in this particular city. The old planter aristocracy not only never went away, they still run that city. And they are really the founders of the thing that it is best known for, that if you're a tourist who's visited New Orleans, I'd say chances are better than even that you went there for Mardi Gras, right? You probably went there for Mardi Gras. So this, I got to say, I'm a little ashamed, man, because I've been to Mardi Gras 3 times. And it was only this time that I really started to become aware of what the origins of Mardi Gras were. So this is one of the displays here. This is, okay, so the parades are sponsored by Crews, Krewe. And the first of these crews was called the Crew of Comus, which still exists. And originally, Mardi Gras, it came from a European tradition of, it was kind of a topsy-turvy day where people would go and kind of make fun of the rich and throw garbage at people. And right, it was kind of that, one of those just festival, release all the demons for the year, right? The Crew of Comus were leading wealthy citizens who got together to emulate the aristocracies of Europe and to bring dignity and order to the Mardi Gras festivities and to quiet down the poor and have them show deference to their betters. So in 1857, they started the tradition of the Mardi Gras parades, where, as you will see in my own footage, some traditions still continue. Obviously, they were pulling carriages. Those were the floats then. And you had blacks, often slaves, called flambeaux, carrying flames. And they would throw trinkets to the crowd. That's where that tradition comes from. So after the Civil War, the crews that existed, the original crews like Comus, like Rex, we'll get into that. They were avowed white supremacists. They supported that insurrection we mentioned earlier, that they had a monument there too. Many were members of the White League, which continued for quite a while. Many were members of the Ku Klux Klan. So this was their celebration, and who they celebrated in 1884. So Comus had reigned without a queen since 1857. In 1884, a ball was held at the French Opera House. The organization honored Mildred Lee and Mary Lee, daughters of General Robert E. Lee, Verena Winnie Davis, daughter of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Nanny Hill, daughter of General Daniel H. Hill, and Julia Jackson, daughter of General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. Though not officially designated as such at the time, the daughters of the Confederacy are considered to have been Comus's first court, and Mildred Lee the first queen of Comus. So to understand how just deranged this gets, they have a court, right? And you have maids in waiting, and they emulate all the aristocratic traditions of Europe, but they'll get local prominent children of prominent citizens to be the court and the maids in waiting, and that sort of thing. So they have the original jewels. So when you get thrown these Mardi Gras beads, that's an emulation of. You're getting the version for the poors, imitating what the richies get, right? Okay, so again, in this day and age, these people who talk about white supremacy and structural racism, their heads are stuck in the past. It might have been like that in the 19th century, but things have changed now. Oh. Elite white New Orleans. Mardi Gras hasn't freed itself from vestiges of racism. The oldest crews, Comus, Momus, Rex, and Proteus, were founded in the 19th century when New Orleans was a wealthy port and white men controlled the town. Today, New Orleans is a majority black city. Most politicians have been black since Dutch Morial was elected mayor in 1978. But the elite so-called old line carnival crews remain all male and almost exclusively white. City Council tried to make the crews diversify in 1991. It passed an anti-discrimination ordinance that required parading crews to integrate. Rex extended invitations to 3 black men. Comus, Momus, and Proteus chose to cease parading. Proteus reinstituted its parade in 2000, signing an affidavit that it did not discriminate on the basis of race. Comus and Momus have remained off the streets. The overall myth, quote, the overall myth is that somehow New Orleans is more racially progressive or laissez-faire than the rest of the South. This is the story that New Orleans loves to tell itself, said Max Sikakini, an anthropologist and musicologist at Tulane University. And when you go back into the historical record, it's just not true. It's not complicated. The origins of Mardi Gras are Confederate explicitly, Sakakini said. Although Comus and Momus keep their members secret, tax records reveal these men run banks, sit on boards, and have a hand in nearly every aspect of civic life in New Orleans. Activist Flozell Daniels Jr. called them the shadow government of New Orleans. Plus, fancy elite balls shape the lives of young people. That's what worried Rhonda Broussard, founder and CEO of Beloved Community, a group that works to create racial and economic equity. The society that is grooming these young people is holding onto white supremacy, she said. It's not a question of a dying legacy. Groups like these are actively continuing that culture. So how are they continuing that culture? Well, at the close of Mardi Gras, Comus traditionally meets up with Rex. They do this at the Marriott, and they have a big ball. So was Comus driven out of the public square for deciding not to parade sooner than integrate? No, this is on public television every year in New Orleans. So you want to see some of the dorkiest white shit you ever saw in your life? There's a little clip from, I believe this was the 2018 close of festivities. So the crew of Rex and the crew of Comus come together in this ritual.
And there's the Queen's mother.
Okay, so now I want to point out. All right, so if you see the guy on the left, he's got a full face mask. Okay, so when Rex agreed, they invited 3 black people to join their crew to fulfill this requirement. But technically, they're secret societies. So Comus, because they never went along with that, they never had to reveal their membership. So that's why he has a full face mask on. So their membership, it is the creepy white supremacist secret society where they fully mask themselves so you won't know who the members are. So that is your king of Comus for that year. Okay. So to give you an idea of what kind of an event this is, so we're not going to read through this, but you can see this is like the old society pages, right? This is the local newspaper in New Orleans. Maids of honor were Mrs. Sophie Wilson, right? It's very much that. Now, as you know, as most of you know, I was at Mardi Gras this year. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what you see that does continue these traditions. And I will say, as a white dude from the North, seeing shit like this, like, what is that, the fucking Klan? Is it the Klan riding out here? What the hell is that? You know, you have these guys in these masks that look like the Klan, basically. So take a look, and you'll see it. You'll see in this clip horse riders and also still black torchbearers or flambeaux. You also see a lot of military presence in the parade, and you see a lot of all black high school and college marching bands are represented, but not on the floats. On the floats, it's pretty much still all white people up on these floats, and these were the parades of the crew of Morpheus and the crew of Bacchus. So here you can see, look, man, like, did I see a kind of evocation of the Old South in this? I mean, sure I did. But having researched it, I realized that was not an accident, because it is rooted in those customs. Now, eventually, blacks formed their own crew, the Zulu crew. This is a little bit of what you see at the Zulu parade, which again, I mean, you choose to put on makeup that has its origin in minstrel shows. I mean, it's not for me to judge, but clearly somebody wearing that kind of makeup and that kind of wig, it's rooted in some very ugly traditions. Now, finally, just to wrap this up, when you want to talk about structural racism or systemic racism, you might want to say, well, you know, it's the South, it's peculiar, you have a very old, dark history down there. But I think nothing could show more the real existence of a blindness to a racial perspective that is woven through even things that we just wouldn't really look twice at. All right, so now you've just toured that museum as much as you're going to without going there yourself, right? So I want to show you how travel guides describe that museum. Lonely Planet. Travel guide and good and really kind of hip standing, right? That's the hip travel guide. Tattered gray uniforms, rebel swords, and faded diaries. This collection of Civil War memorabilia pays homage to the Confederacy and locals who fought for that cause. The museum used to be a center of Confederate apologia. Today, it's been largely politically corrected. Note the different names it's known by. But it remains a collection of things, as opposed to a contemporary, interpretation-driven educational museum. With that said, many of the personal effects are fascinating. Okay, so it's not what Confederate apologia. So this is what people mean when they say you need to get woke for real. Right? Because a lot of people will read this and say, Oh, yeah, no. That museum does not have Confederate connotations. There's Lonely Planet. Is it only Lonely Planet? Is that an outlier? Nope. Fromers. Here is the Confederate flag, that hot-button epicenter of controversy, displayed with no glamour or judgment. It's a history museum, after all, and a good one, if you're interested in the Civil War or architecture. The unusual circa 1891 press brick Romanesque building is a stunner, inside and out. Among thousands of relics, the second largest collection in the U.S. are weapons, uniforms, portraits, and the personal effects of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. Of note, an elegant piano, saved from a fine Mississippi home pre-raising that was carried into a trench mid-battle for safekeeping, where it was protected and played as cannonballs flew. Also, a great seal of the short-lived Confederate States of America circa 1862, and an Alabama Legion battle flag with 83 painstakingly mended bullet holes. Now, to read that, you would think, hey, it's just neutral at worst. This is what people mean when they say racism is woven throughout the culture and most people are blind to it. Because if you've actually been to that museum and you read this, you have got to be very unconscious to the connotations of a museum like that to give it that kind of a review. You know, people talk about, well, this person got accused unfairly. They got that. Okay, yeah, that happens, and I talk about it. This is part of why I want to do a segment like this. I feel like it's an only Nixon can go to China thing. You know, I have no patience for that kind of shit, for false accusations, for unfair ginning up of racial tension. But I've always said in those segments, it's not that I don't think there's systemic racism. I just think this is a distraction from the systemic racism that really exists. When travel guides in good standing like Lonely Planet or Fromers are going to describe what I just showed you as politically neutral, having changed their ways, yeah, how do you interpret that as anything but a white supremacist point of view being so woven into the culture that it's invisible to people? Because you talk about professors who might get unjustly accused for stupid reasons. And again, I'm not shy about talking about that. But look at all the things like that that don't get called out. Look at all the things that don't get asked to change. Fromers and Lonely Planet should not be describing that museum that way. They should be telling people to stay as far away from it as possible. My big question is why there are no protests outside, and maybe they're afraid of that shadow government that is described in that article that is the real power running New Orleans. You want to understand why a city that is majority black, 50% of the black people are in poverty. Well, they're not actually running it. They might be the political class, but they're not running the money. He who controls the coinage, right, controls the society. Well, the people at that ball behind those masks are actually running the banks down there.
Yeah, and certain hegemonic points of view have a way of enforcing themselves no matter what the popular will of the population is. You know, I mean, we got a real taste of that. We're getting a real taste of that now. Whenever you see an Israel-Gaza debate, that's the same thing. I mean, that is certainly a Western supremacist, and I would argue a white supremacist ideology. The idea that European Jews have a right to settle in Arab land because the white people didn't want them, so we'll force them on the brown people. What are they going to do, right? And there is no real questioning of that allowed in certain circles. And so there are certain ideas that you're just not supposed to question in certain circles. You know, one of the I mean, this is a trivial example, but like one of the woke things that happened, the quote unquote woke things that happened, was that band Lady Antebellum, after the George Floyd murder, changed their name to Lady A because Antebellum was considered pretty racist. And I thought it was pretty weird to have a mainstream band called Lady Antebellum before George Floyd.
Right.
I'm like, why is it okay to name a popular band that? Like, why is nobody saying what? Like, you couldn't think of any other name besides that?
Lady Luftwaffe SS.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like, I thought that was strange. You know, now they changed it after George Floyd because, the tastes of America change. But there's a certain just unacknowledged currents of racism that runs underneath the society that just kind of goes on. I love that. That's good. I love that. Lady IDF. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, exactly. Like, there are certain things you look at and you think of a little while like, huh, what is that? And they go unquestioned all the time. Yeah. It's not uncommon. It really is not uncommon. It seems uncommon because you don't often think about it. Like, that's how ingrained it is. Because it doesn't always catch your eye. There's a lot of things that take 2 or 3 double takes to catch your eye. That Lady Antebellum thing caught my eye at the first time I heard it. All right. And I didn't make a big deal out of it. I know a few of their songs. They're good, good band. I didn't boycott them or anything. But I'm like, yeah, this is weird.
Well, that is the real meaning of woke. When I went to college, even as late as the 90s, there was still that, macho association with the Stars and Bars, man. Guy across the hall from me had the Stars and Bars. And honestly, this is where I feel the intersection of class and race is complicated, because the person I related to most on my dorm was a black girl.
Right.
Because we both didn't come from anything. So we used to make fun of everybody's dorkiness. These were very dorky, naive white kids to us. Like, we were able to bond on that. But at the same time, you want to talk about what the difference is. I never thought anything of that flag. But I was sitting with her one day in that dorm room, and she said to me quietly, I know this place isn't for me. Look at that flag.
Right.
And I was like, man, I never even paid attention to the fact that flag is there.
Right.
That's the meaning of woke. That woke me up. Like, oh shit. Right. Why is that supposed to be cool or macho or acceptable to have a flag? You don't fly a Nazi flag.
Right.
How is that different? You got Germans walking around who feel bad about the lost cause of the Nazis. We don't coddle them.
Right. Right. Yeah. They don't have their own gift shops. Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Right. It's not acceptable to have a portrait of Himmler on your bookmark.
Please clap.